When Michael Jordan unfolded that single sheet of paper, his hands were not shaking. That surprised him. He had faced down defenders in Game 7. He had stood at free throw lines, with the entire world holding its breath. He had walked into rooms where every person in them wanted something from him. A signature, a photo, a piece of whatever he had built over 6 championships, and a lifetime of refusing to lose. His hands never shook then either. But this was different. This was not a game. This was not a negotiation. This was a lab report printed on plain white paper, sitting in a manila envelope that had been sitting on his desk for 11 days before he finally opened it. 11 days. The strange part was not what the paper said. The strange part was why he had waited so long to read it. 3 weeks earlier, Michael Jordan had taken a DNA test on a dare. It started the way most unexpected things in his life started, with laughter. A dinner table. Old friends who knew him well enough to push. One of them, a man he had known since his Carolina days, had just gotten his own results back. He was animated about it, waving his phone around, pointing at percentages like they were personal achievements. "You should do it," the friend said. "Everybody's doing it." Michael had smiled the way he smiles when he is not really listening, polite, present, somewhere else entirely. "What are you afraid of?" another voice said from across the table. That was the word that changed everything. Michael Jordan does not walk away from that word. He never has. Not in 1984, not in 1991, not now. You could call it competitiveness. You could call it pride. The people who knew him best called it something simpler. He just could not let a challenge sit unanswered. Not then, not ever. He ordered the kit that same night. Before we continue, drop a comment and tell us what city or country you are watching from right now. We read every single one. The kit arrived in 4 days. It sat on the kitchen counter for 3 more. He swabbed, he sealed. He sent it back without thinking much about it, because in that moment it felt like nothing. A novelty, a dinosaur story, a small thing to win against a dare from an old friend. He forgot about it almost immediately. Then the results came, and Michael Jordan, a man who had spent his entire adult life preparing for every possible outcome, found himself holding something he had not prepared for at all. What was on that paper would take him somewhere he had never been, would show him something he had never seen, would connect him to a name he did not recognize, and a place that did not appear on any map he had ever looked at. Stay with us through this entire story, because what happens next is something you are not going to see coming. And by the time it is over, you are never going to think about Michael Jordan the same way again. The house was quiet the morning he opened the envelope. Not the Charlotte mansion, not the place the cameras knew. This was the smaller house, the one he kept for the mornings when he did not want to be Michael Jordan. The one with the old wooden floors that creaked in the hallway, and a kitchen that smelled like coffee before anyone had made any, just from years of mornings, exactly like this one. He was wearing a gray sweatshirt that had been washed so many times, the lettering on the front had faded to almost nothing. His feet were bare on the cool tile. The coffee maker was running. Outside the sky was the color of pewter, not stormy, just undecided, the way early mornings sometimes are. He had not slept well. He picked up the envelope from the counter and stood there for a long moment, not reading it, just holding it. Feeling the weight of it, which was almost nothing, a few grams, a folded sheet of paper, and yet somehow it felt heavier than it should have. He opened it. The first section was what he expected. Broad geographic ancestry, West African heritage, the dominant line which he knew. British Isles, a trace of Southern European. Numbers and percentages that told the story of the Atlantic and everything that terrible crossing had cost. He read it carefully. He nodded slowly. The way you nod when something confirms what you already suspected. Then he turned the page. There was a secondary report, a section titled, Population Matches and Regional Clusters. One line near the bottom had been highlighted by the system's algorithm, not by a person, just the software flagging an anomaly, a statistical outlier, a cluster of DNA that matched a very specific and very small population group, with a concentration percentage that was not large enough to be prominent, but was far too high to be random noise. The cluster was traced to a region in West Africa, specifically to a sub-region the report described as low-density rural, partially unregistered in national census data. Beneath that, in small gray font, a note. This population cluster corresponds to fewer than 2,000 living individuals. It represents one of the most genetically isolated communities in the dataset. Matches at this level suggest a direct ancestral line, not incidental overlap. Michael read that sentence 3 times. Fewer than 2,000 living individuals. He set the paper down on the counter. The coffee maker beeped. He did not move. Outside, a bird landed on the windowsill and looked in at him with the particular indifference that birds have for human problems. Then it was gone. What Michael Jordan did not know yet, what he could not have known standing in that kitchen in his faded sweatshirt with the coffee going cold behind him, was that the name at the bottom of that report was not just a place. It was a thread, and pulling it was going to unravel something he had carried without knowing he was carrying it his entire life. He picked up his phone. He called one person. Not a lawyer, not an assistant. The one person he had trusted with the complicated parts of his life since before the complicated parts began. The call lasted 4 minutes. When it ended, Michael Jordan stood very still for a long moment. Then he said 3 words out loud to an empty kitchen. We will come back to what those 3 words were, because to understand why they mattered, why they landed in that room the way they did, you have to understand where Michael Jordan actually came from. Not the highlight reels. Not the documentaries, the real story, the one with dirt on it, the one nobody talks about at the dinner tables. To understand why Michael Jordan was standing here, you have to go back, not just months or years. You have to go back to the beginning, Wilmington, North Carolina. Not the Wilmington of brochures or tourism websites. The Wilmington of 1968, when the streets had a particular kind of tension in them. The kind that lived in the space between people, in the way certain conversations stopped. When certain people walked into a room, the kind of tension that a child absorbs without understanding, the way a sponge absorbs water, taking it in quietly until it is so full it cannot hold any more. James and Dolores Jordan raised 5 children in that world. They raised them with something that is difficult to describe and impossible to manufacture. A specific combination of discipline and warmth that produces people who are both tough and tender at the same time. People who can take a hit and still feel something. People who know what it costs to build a life because they watched their parents build one brick by brick, year by year, with their hands. Michael was the 4th child. He was not, by any early measure, the obvious one. That is the part the legend tends to skip. The part where the greatest basketball player who ever lived was, for a stretch of his adolescence, simply a boy who got cut. A 15-year-old standing in a hallway at Laney High School, reading a list posted on a wall, running his finger down the names of the boys who had made the varsity team. His name was not there. He read the list again and again. Then he walked home. He did not talk about it. He went to his room, and, according to the story he has told himself and others many times since, he cried. Not the performative crying of someone who wants to be seen crying. The private kind. The kind that comes out when no one is watching, when the door is shut, and the room is dark, and there is no audience for what you are feeling. And then something happened in that room that no camera ever captured. He decided, not loudly, not with a speech, just a private iron decision that settled into him the way convictions do when they are real, quietly, completely, with no drama and no announcement. He would not be left off a list again. 6 championships, 5 MVP awards, 14 All-Star appearances, a cultural force so large it bent the entire sport around it. And right now, a 59-year-old man in a faded sweatshirt, standing alone in a kitchen, undone by a piece of paper. But here is what the highlight reels never show. Here is the part that matters for what comes later. Michael Jordan grew up in a family that talked about history, not as a subject, not as something that lived in textbooks, but as a living thing, as something present in the room. James Jordan Sr., Michael's father, was a man who carried the past with a particular kind of dignity. He knew where he came from. He spoke about lineage, the way some families speak about scripture, with reverence, with care, with the understanding that, knowing where you come from, is one of the few things no one can ever take from you. James would say that sometimes, sitting on the porch in the evenings, the air thick with Carolina summer. They can take a lot of things. They can't take where you come from. Michael heard that hundreds of times growing up. He absorbed it the way he absorbed everything his father said completely, without always understanding it, storing it somewhere deep, until the moment it was needed. His father was murdered in 1993. Michael Jordan was at the peak of everything. 3 championships, the undisputed best player on the planet, a name that children in countries he had never visited wore on their backs. And then one phone call, and the person who had been the bedrock of all of it, the first man who ever believed in him, who drove him to practices, who sat in the stands before the stands were full, was gone. He retired that October. Most people framed it as burnout. Some people suspected other things. The real answer was simpler and sadder and more human than either theory. He was lost. When you lose the person who knew you before the world decided what you were, you lose something that cannot be replaced by championships or crowds or the adulation of strangers. You lose the one mirror that showed you as a person rather than a symbol. You lose the voice that called you Michael instead of MJ. He came back. He always came back. 3 more championships. A second act that defied every expectation. But there was something he never resolved. Something his father had said in those porch evening conversations that Michael had never quite followed through on. Something about lineage. About going back further. About the part of the family story that predated America entirely. The part that existed before the crossing, before the names were changed, before the generations of silence that followed. James Jordan had always said they came from somewhere specific. Not just Africa in the broad colonial sense, but somewhere. A people. A place with a name. He just never found out where. And after 1993, Michael had told himself he would find out. For his father. For the children who would come after him. For the particular kind of peace that comes from knowing the whole story instead of just the chapter you were handed. He told himself that. And then 30 years went by. The way 30 years do in a rush and a blur, in seasons and championships and business ventures, and the relentless forward motion of a life that never really slowed down long enough to look backwards. Until a dinner table dare, until a manila envelope, until a coffee maker beeps in an empty kitchen. What Michael Jordan was about to discover would not just answer the question his father never got to answer. It would raise a question his father never thought to ask. He hired a researcher, not a genealogy company, not a television production looking for a feel-good segment. A single person, a woman named Dr. Adaeze Okonkwo, an academic whose specialty was diaspora genetics and West African oral history, was recommended by a university contact who described her in exactly 4 words. She finds real things. Dr. Okonkwo was based in London. She had spent 15 years cross-referencing DNA databases with colonial-era records, church logs, slave manifests, and, most critically, the oral histories maintained by village elders in communities that had never been fully absorbed into the written record. She reviewed Michael's results in 48 hours. Then she called him. Michael had expected a report, a document, something he could read at his own pace in a quiet room. Instead, he got a 12-minute phone call that ended with him sitting very still on the edge of his bed, phone still pressed to his ear long after the call had ended, staring at a spot on the floor that had nothing on it. Dr. Okonkwo had said 3 things in that call that mattered. The first was expected. The second was surprising. The third stopped him completely. We are not going to tell you what the third thing was yet, because to understand why it stopped him, why a man who had heard everything, survived everything, and built everything, sat on the edge of his bed, and stared at a blank floor, you need to understand what Dr. Okonkwo found when she started pulling the thread. And that story begins not in America, not in the 1800s, not with a ship. It begins with a name that had survived 300 years of erasure, hidden inside the genetics of a bloodline, carried unknowingly through every generation, through every city, through every championship and every loss, and every porch evening conversation in Wilmington, North Carolina, waiting, just waiting for someone to look. But here's what nobody knew yet. What happens next will completely change how you see everything that just happened. The name was Akwantu, not a person, a place, or rather, what had once been a place. What Okonkwo described in the careful and precise language of someone who had spent 15 years learning to separate hope from evidence, as a semi-persistent settlement in a rural corridor of Ghana's central region, approximately 40 kilometers from the coast. Semi-persistent. Michael had asked her what that meant. She had paused before answering, the kind of pause that means someone is deciding how honest to be. It means, she said, that it exists, but barely. It is the kind of place that does not appear on government maps, because it was never large enough to register. The kind of place that has been there for centuries, precisely because it was never large enough to be worth taking. She explained what she had found. The DNA cluster in Michael's results was not a vague regional match. It was specific, abnormally specific for a diaspora sample, with 3 centuries of distance between source and subject. It pointed to a founding population, a tight genetic community that had remained largely isolated, not by choice but by geography, a village nestled into a landscape that made it difficult to reach and therefore easy to forget. Fewer than 2,000 living individuals. The report had said that, but Dr. Okonkwo had a more precise number. The last oral census, taken by the village's own record keeper 3 years ago, counted 412 people, she said. That number includes children. 412 people. Michael said nothing. The reason your match is so high, she continued, is that the genetic line appears to trace back to a specific family within that community, not just the village generally. A family. The records I have found, and I want to be careful here because some of this is oral history rather than documented record, suggest the name associated with that family line. She said it then, the name. And Michael Jordan, who had heard his own name spoken by hundreds of millions of people across 6 decades and every continent on Earth, felt something move in his chest at the sound of a name that was not his. A name that was, according to 3 centuries of genetics and one woman's 15 years of research, the name his family had carried before they carried Jordan. He did not repeat it out loud. Not yet. That name was going to stay private for a little longer. Because names, when they are that old, when they carry that much weight, deserve to be spoken in the right place. Not on a phone call, not alone in a room, in the place they came from. What Michael Jordan was feeling in that moment was something he did not have a word for. He was not sure one existed. He told 3 people, his eldest son, his closest friend from his Carolina years, and one other person, a member of his family, who had spent years doing quiet research into their genealogy, who had always believed there was a specific place, who had kept a folder of documents and photographs and half-answers that never quite connected. When Michael told this family member what Dr. Okonkwo had found, there was a long silence on the phone. Then the sound of something being set down carefully. A chair being pulled out. Your father always said, the family member began, and then stopped. Michael waited. He always said, we came from somewhere that remembered us, even if we didn't remember it. Michael had heard his father say that. He had filed it away as poetry, the kind of thing fathers say to give their children a sense of belonging in a world that frequently tries to take that sense away. He had never taken it literally. He was starting to.
Doctor?
Okonkwo sent over a file that evening. 47 pages. Scanned documents, annotated photographs, excerpts from academic papers on pre-colonial communities in the central region, cross-referenced genealogical records, and at the very end, a single photograph, black and white, date-stamped 1962, showing a collection of structures at the edge of a tree line, small buildings, a cleared space in the center, several figures standing at various distances from the camera, their faces not quite visible at this resolution, their posture carrying the particular quality of people who belong, completely, to where they are standing. At the bottom of the photograph, in handwritten ink that had faded to pale brown, Akwantu, Cr. Pop, approx. 300. Michael looked at that photograph for a long time. He thought about his father, about those porch evenings in Wilmington, about the way James Jordan had always said where you come from, like it was a place you could return to, not just a point of origin you could never reach. He thought about the 15-year-old boy who had cried in a dark room after reading a list on a wall. He thought about 30 years. There were 3 things Michael noticed about that photograph. The third one stopped him cold. The first was the tree line, a specific arrangement of palms that Dr. Okonkwo had noted in her file, describing it as a geographical constant, unchanged across decades, one of the markers she had used to confirm the location. The second was the cleared central space, which she had identified as significant, a traditional communal gathering point whose presence indicated a community with continuous cultural practice, not a settlement that had formed and dissolved. The third thing was a structure visible at the far left edge of the frame, small, partially obscured by shadow, but distinct enough at the corner of the roof line to show a particular architectural detail that Dr. Okonkwo had flagged with a single asterisk and a note that read, "See page 31. Michael turned to page 31. He read it, and then he did something he had not done in a very long time. He picked up the phone and called Dr. Okonkwo at 11:30 at night without checking the time difference. She answered on the second ring. "You read page 31, she said. Not a question. Is this real? Michael said. Another pause, longer than the first one. I believe it is, she said. But the only way to know for certain is to go. What would you have done in Michael's position? A man who could send a team of researchers, who could commission a documentary, who could know this story from a distance and a safe remove, but who was being told that the only way to know for certain was to go himself. Tell us what you would do in the comments below. He almost did not go. That is the part that is important to say plainly. Because it would be easy to tell this story as though the decision was obvious, as though a man who had spent his life chasing things simply pointed himself at this new thing and ran. It was not like that. There was a version of Michael Jordan, the careful one, the controlled one, who had spent 40 years managing exactly what the world knew about him and what it did not, who looked at this situation and saw risk. Not physical risk, something more complicated, the risk of wanting something and not finding it. The risk of building a story in your head, your father's voice, a name, a photograph, and then arriving somewhere and finding that the story you had built did not match what was actually there. He had been disappointed by reality before. He knew what it felt like to chase something and arrive at the destination, and find that the destination was not what the journey had promised. He sat with that fear for 4 days. He did not call Dr. Okonkwo, he did not research flights. He went through his normal days, meetings, and calls, the ordinary machinery of a life that never really stops, and he carried the question with him, like a stone in a coat pocket, aware of it constantly, not looking at it directly. On the 4th day he was driving, not being driven. Driving himself the way he does when he needs to think, and he passed a park where a group of kids were playing basketball on an outdoor court. It was late afternoon. The light was doing that specific thing it does in autumn, going golden long, making ordinary things look significant. He pulled over. He sat and watched for a few minutes. One kid in particular caught his attention. Couldn't have been more than 12. Small for his age, getting pushed around a little in the paint, missing shots. But every time he missed, he went straight back. No hesitation, no adjustment period, just immediately back into position, hand up, ready to receive the ball again. Michael watched him miss 4 shots in a row. On the 5th attempt, the ball went in. The kid did not celebrate. He just nodded once, like something had been confirmed that he already knew. Michael drove home. He called Dr. Okonkwo. "I'm going," he said. "I know," she said. He asked her how she knew. She said, "Because you called. If you weren't going, you wouldn't have called. You would have just stayed quiet." She was right. She had a habit of being right. They planned the trip in 6 days. No camera crew, no publicist, no advance team. Dr. Okonkwo, Michael, and a local guide she had worked with before, a man named Kofi, who had grown up 3 villages from Akwantu, and who knew the road in a way that could not be learned from a map. The flight was 14 hours. Michael slept for 2 of them. For the other 12 he sat, with the window shade up, watching the darkness outside, and thought about his father, about the folder of half-answers his family member had kept for years, about page 31 of Dr. Okonkwo's report, and the thing it described, and why, if it was real, it changed the entire shape of what he thought he knew. He thought about a name that had survived 300 years of erasure. He thought about 412 people in a village that did not appear on any map, And somewhere over the Atlantic, in the dark, flying in the direction of something he could not yet see, Michael Jordan felt, for the first time in a very long time, something that was not drive, not competitiveness, not the hunger that had defined every room he had ever entered. He felt something quieter, something that sat in the chest differently. He did not have a word for it, he would find one. But not yet, the road ends. Not gradually. Not with a sign or a barrier or any kind of official acknowledgement that this is where the mapped world stops and something older begins. It just ends. The vehicle stops. Kofi cuts the engine. The silence that follows is not empty. It is full of sound, layered and alive, the kind of silence that cities have forgotten exists. Birds, wind, something moving in the grass to the left. The tick of the cooling engine. Michael opens the door. He steps out. The ground is red, the particular deep red of laterite soil, packed hard by decades of feet. The air smells like wood smoke, and something green and living underneath it, not the green of cut grass but deep, older, the green of things that have been growing in the same place for a very long time. He stands still. Dr. Okonkwo comes around the front of the vehicle. She does not say anything. She has done this before, has stood at the edge of places where the past is closer to the surface than anywhere else on Earth, and she knows that the first moments require silence. Kofi points. Through the tree line, a gap, light beyond it, they walk. The path through the trees is narrow, single file, branches at shoulder height. The light ahead grows slowly, the way dawn grows, not in a rush, not all at once, but incrementally, each step revealing slightly more than the last. Michael watches his feet on the path. Red soil, roots crossing the path like old fingers, leaves pressed flat by rain. He is breathing carefully. He notices this about himself. The deliberate breath, the controlled inhale, the same breath he used to take in the tunnel before walking out into a stadium of 20,000 people. Same breath, different reason. The trees open, and there it is. Akwantu, 412 people. A cleared central space. Structures at the edges, built from earth and wood and corrugated metal, each one sitting in its position with the settled confidence of something that has been sitting exactly where it is for a very long time. A woman is grinding something near the first structure. She looks up. A child, maybe 7, maybe 8, stops running and stands completely still, watching the three figures emerge from the tree line. An old man is seated in the shade of a wide tree at the far edge of the clearing. He does not look up immediately. He is doing something with his hands. Something small and deliberate. Michael stops walking. He stands at the edge of the clearing. He does not move for a full minute. Later, weeks later, in a conversation he will have with his eldest son, he will try to describe what he felt in that minute. He will start 3 different sentences and abandon all 3 of them. He will eventually say only this: "It felt like arriving somewhere I'd already been, except I'd never been anywhere like it in my life." 6 championships, 5 MVP awards, 14 All-Star selections. A brand worth more than most countries' annual budgets. Arenas that shook when he walked into them. A name that children learned before they could read. And right now, a 59-year-old man is standing at the edge of a red dirt clearing, unable to take a single step forward, undone completely by the smell of wood smoke and the sight of an old man sitting under a tree. Dr. Okonkwo speaks quietly to Kofi. Kofi walks ahead into the clearing. He approaches the old man under the tree. They speak. The language moves too fast for Michael to follow. Kofi gestures back toward Michael once. The old man's hands go still. He looks up. Across the clearing, Michael Jordan and this man, this elder, this keeper, this last living thread of something 3 centuries long, look at each other for the first time. The distance between them is perhaps 30 meters. It feels like nothing. It feels like everything. The old man's name is Kwame Asante. He is 81 years old. He has lived in Akwantu his entire life. He was born here. His father was born here. His grandfather. His grandfather's grandfather. A line so continuous, so unbroken, that it makes the Atlantic crossing and the centuries of silence on the other side of it feel, in this moment, standing in this clearing, like a chapter in a longer book. Not the whole story, just a chapter. Kofi waves Michael forward. Michael walks. The red soil under his feet, the insects in the grass. The child is still standing completely still, watching. He reaches the shade of the tree. He stops. Kwame Asante looks up at him. His face is deeply lined. His eyes are the particular dark brown that holds light rather than reflecting it. His hands, resting now on his knees, are the hands of a man who has spent 81 years using them for real things. He says something. Kofi translates. He says he has been waiting for someone to come back. Michael hears that. He stands very still. He says it was not a question of if, only when. The air moves through the clearing. The woman who was grinding has stopped. She is watching from a distance. More people have appeared at the edges of the clearing now. Quietly. Without announcement. The way communities gather when something significant is happening. Not in a rush, not with noise, just a gradual accumulation of presence. 412 people. Some of them are here, watching. Michael looks at Kwame Asante and feels something that starts in his chest and moves outward. It is not grief exactly, not joy exactly. It is the specific feeling of a question being answered that you did not know you had been asking. His father's voice. They can't take where you come from. His father knew. Not the details. Not the name, not the coordinates, not the 412. But he knew there was a somewhere. He carried it, that knowledge, imprecise, inherited, worn smooth by generations of handling, and he passed it to his son the only way he could. In the language of porch evenings and quiet conviction, they can't take where you come from. Michael Jordan bends, slowly, with the particular care of a man who is aware that this is not a performance, that no one should have to watch this, that this moment belongs to him, and to Kwame Asante, and to everyone who crossed an ocean in chains, and lost the name on the other side. He sits down, in the red dirt, in the shade of the tree, next to the old man. No camera, no crowd, no one is waiting for a quote, just two people. One clearing, 300 years of distance closing. Kwame Asante reaches into the cloth beside him. He removes something, small, wrapped in fabric that has been folded many times. He holds it out. Michael looks at it. He does not take it immediately. He looks at Kwame's face first, asking the question without words. Kwame nods. Michael takes it. He unwraps it carefully. The fabric is old, the kind of old that has texture, that tells you it has passed through many hands before reaching yours. Inside is a small carved object. Wood, dark with age, perhaps 4 inches long, a figure, humanoid, abstract, the proportions slightly elongated in the way of certain traditional West African figurative art, the kind of object that lives in museum cases behind glass, labeled and distant, stripped of whatever it was before it became an artifact. Except this one never went to a museum. This one stayed here. Michael holds it in both hands. He turns it over. On the base, carved into the wood in letters that are faint but legible, is a name, not in English, but Dr. Okonkwo is beside him now and she reads it quietly. And it is the name from the report, the name that had survived 3 centuries of erasure, carried in genetics, in bloodlines, in the quiet inheritance of people who never knew they were carrying it. The family name. His family name, the one that existed before Jordan. Michael does not speak. His hands are shaking. He notices this. After everything, after Game 7s and free throws and negotiations and losses that felt unsurvivable and victories that felt insufficient, after all of it, his hands are shaking. He does not try to stop them. He lets them shake. He holds the carved figure in both trembling hands, and he looks at the name on its base, and he thinks about his father, who never made it here, who never got to sit in this shade, who never got to hold this thing. And he cries. Not the private cry of a 15-year-old boy in a dark room. The other kind, the kind that comes when something lost has been found, when a door you had stopped believing existed turns out to have been there the whole time, waiting. The kind that sounds like relief. Kwame Asante watches him. He does not look away. He does not offer comfort in words. He simply sits with the weight of this moment, the way elders sit with things, fully, without flinching, with the understanding that some feelings need to be witnessed, rather than solved. He puts one hand on Michael's arm. That is all, that is enough. The child who had been watching from across the clearing, the one who stopped running when Michael emerged from the trees, has moved closer now. Standing maybe 10 feet away, watching with the complete attention that children give to things they sense are important without knowing why. Michael looks up, sees the child. The child does not run. Michael almost smiles. He will, soon, but not yet. He stayed for 9 days, not the 1 day he had planned, not the 3 days Dr. Okonkwo had gently suggested as a realistic timeline for a man whose calendar was never truly empty. 9 days. In Akwantu, in a village of 412 people that did not appear on any government map, he slept in a structure at the edge of the clearing. Simple. A cot, a single window that faced east, so the first thing he saw every morning was the light coming through the trees, that slow, incremental dawn light, the kind that cities have engineered themselves out of experiencing. He woke up early every day. He sat outside before anyone else was moving. He just sat. Michael Jordan, who had not simply sat without purpose, since he was a teenager, sat in the red dirt outside a small structure in a village in Ghana, and watched the light come up over the tree line, and did not check his phone, and did not think about what needed to happen next. He just sat. Later he would describe those mornings as the first real silence he had heard in 30 years. Not the absence of sound. Akwantu was never without sound, always alive with birds and wind, and the ambient texture of a community at work. The silence he meant was internal, the particular quiet that comes when you stop performing yourself for a moment and simply exist. He had forgotten what that felt like. He was remembering. On the second day, Kwame Asante began to talk, not in English, through Kofi, who translated with the patient precision of someone who understood that certain things lose everything in translation if you rush them. Kwame spoke slowly, deliberately, the way very old people speak, when they know they are saying something for the last time that will ever need to be said, because after this, someone else will carry it. He told Michael about the family, not the American family, the older one, the root family, the line that the genetics had traced and Dr. Okonkwo had documented, and that Kwame had carried in living memory for 81 years, because it was his job to carry it. Because in Akwantu, someone was always given that job. The remembering. Kwame's father had been given it before him, and his father's father before that, a continuous chain of human memories stretching back through the centuries, through the period when people from this coastline were taken, when families were split at the water's edge, when names were stripped and languages were forbidden, and the thread between here and wherever it was supposed to be was cut so violently that most people stopped believing the thread had ever existed. But in Akwantu, someone always remembered, someone always kept the name, someone always said they went across the water. Some of them, not all, some stayed, some went. The ones who went, they are still ours, they were always still ours. Michael listened to all of this through Kofi's translation. Sitting across from Kwame, in the shade of the wide tree, the carved figure resting on his knee. He did not interrupt. He did not ask questions. He listened the way his father had taught him to listen. Completely, without preparing his response, without letting the next thought crowd out the current one. He just received it. All of it. 300 years of a family's refusal to forget. On the fourth day, the children found him. It started with the boy, the one who had stood completely still, at the edge of the clearing on the first day, watching with that particular child's seriousness. His name was Ibo. He was 8 years old. He spoke no English, and Michael spoke no Twi, and this turned out to matter not at all. Ibo simply appeared beside Michael one morning while he was sitting outside, and sat down next to him without asking permission. Michael looked at him. Ibo looked back. Then Ibo picked up a small stone from the ground and held it out. Michael took it. Ibo nodded, satisfied, as though a significant agreement had been reached. By the afternoon, there were 6 children. By the following morning, there were 11. They followed Michael through the village with the dedicated curiosity that children bring to things they have decided are interesting. They showed him things. A particular tree with bark that peeled in long, satisfying strips. A spot at the edge of the village, where the ground dipped, and after rain became briefly, a small pool that reflected the sky perfectly. A crack in one of the old structures where a family of birds had built a nest, so intricate it looked engineered. Michael looked at everything they showed him with complete attention. Not the polished attention of a public figure managing an interaction. The real kind. The kind that says, I see what you are showing me, and I understand that it matters. The children noticed the difference. Children always notice the difference. On the 6th day, Michael asked Kofi to help him make a list. He sat with Kofi for 3 hours. He asked questions. About the village, about what it needed, not what would look good in a press release, but what is actually, specifically, and concretely needed. Water infrastructure. A medical supply situation that required a 4-hour journey on a road that became impassable in rainy season. A school building that was currently one room for children of 7 different age groups, with 2 teachers, who had not been paid by the regional government in 8 months. 2 teachers. 8 months. No pay. Still showing up every day. Michael wrote that down and underlined it. He asked about the cultural preservation work Kwame had been doing alone, the oral histories, the genealogical records, and the documentation of a community that had survived centuries of being overlooked by keeping its own memory alive. He asked whether any of it had been recorded in a form that could survive Kwame. It had not. Kwame was 81 years old. The entire living memory of Akwantu existed in one man's mind. Michael wrote that down too. He did not announce what he was going to do. He did not make promises in the village. He had learned, in business, in relationships, and in the long education, of being someone people wanted things from, that announced intentions are worth less than quiet actions, that the most important things he had ever done in his life, he had done without telling anyone first. He folded the list and put it in his pocket. On the 8th day, he asked Kofi to take him back to the path through the trees, the one they had arrived on. He walked it alone, forward and back, standing at the point where the tree line opened into the clearing, looking at Akwantu from the outside. He thought about the 15-year-old boy who cried in a dark room. He thought about the thing that private, iron decision had produced, everything it had produced, the championships, and the contracts, and the cultural force, and the names on the backs of children in countries he had never visited. He thought about all of it. And then he thought about what none of it had given him. What all of it, accumulated, had not been able to provide was the specific kind of stillness he had felt sitting outside that small structure in the early mornings, watching the light come through the trees. The silence that was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something he did not have a word for. He had a word for it now. He had found it here, in a village of 412 people, in the shade of a wide tree, in the hands of an 81-year-old man who had been waiting, not impatiently, not desperately, but with the long patience of someone who was absolutely certain, for someone to come back. The word was belonging, not the belonging of crowds, not the belonging of being recognized, not the belonging of having your name, no, the belonging of knowing your name, the real one, the old one, the one that existed before the crossing, before the silence, before the centuries of forgetting. He stood at the edge of the trees for a long time. Then he walked back into the clearing. On the 9th day, he said goodbye to Kwame Asante. They sat together one final time under the wide tree. The morning light was doing the thing it does, golden long, making ordinary things look significant. Kwame spoke, Kofi translated. He says, "You came from here. You will always come from here. It does not matter how far you went. The distance was never the point. The point was always that you came back." Michael nodded. He reached into his bag. He had brought something from home. He had not known why when he packed it. He had put it in almost instinctively, the way you pack something that feels like it needs to travel with you, even when you cannot explain the reason. It was a photograph. James Jordan, Wilmington, North Carolina. Porch evening. The particular light of a Carolina summer in the photograph, golden and long, not so different from the light in this clearing right now. Michael held it out to Kwame. Kwame took it. He looked at it for a long time. His expression did not change dramatically. No gasp, no theatrical moment of recognition. Just a slow, deep nod. The kind of nod that means yes, I see him. I know what this is, he said something quietly. Kofi's voice, when he translated, was careful. He says, the father knew too, in his bones, they always know. The ones who are ready to know, they always know. Michael looked at the photograph in Kwame's hands. His father, his porch, his voice saying words that a child had stored away, without understanding them, carrying them through 6 championships and 1 unbearable loss and 30 years of forward motion that never quite managed to be stillness. They can't take where you come from. He had not understood it as a literal promise. It was a literal promise. What happened in the months after Michael Jordan returned from Aquantu did not make headlines. That was deliberate. The water infrastructure project was handled through a foundation channel, quietly, without announcement. The paperwork filed under a name that did not immediately connect back to him. Clean water access for a village of 412 people, not a press event, just a thing that got done. The two teachers received retroactive pay, 8 months' worth, delivered without explanation through the regional education office, flagged as an administrative correction of a government error. Which it was. Michael had simply ensured that the correction happened. The school building, a proper one with space for the 7 age groups and storage for materials and a roof that did not require seasonal repair, was completed 11 months later. At the small ceremony marking its opening, attended by the village and by the regional education officer, who had been gently but firmly persuaded to show up, there was a wooden plaque on the wall near the entrance. It bore a name, not Michael Jordan, the old name, the family name. The one carved into the base of the figure Kwame Asante had pressed into his hands on that first afternoon. The name that had survived 300 years of erasure, now carved in wood again, in a new building, in a village that still did not appear on any government map, but that now had clean water and a functioning school and a documentation project, funded, staffed, and underway, recording every oral history Kwame Asante carried before they existed only in one man's memory. Ebo, the 8-year-old who had sat down beside Michael, without asking permission, and handed him a stone, as though that were a perfectly normal way to begin a friendship, was enrolled in the new school's first class. He still had the stone. Michael still had the carved figure. It sat on a shelf in the small house. The one with the old wooden floors and the kitchen that smelled like coffee. The one he kept for mornings when he did not want to be Michael Jordan. He looked at it every morning now, not as a relic, not as a trophy, as a reminder that the most important things you will ever find are not the things you chased. They are the things you were carrying the whole time, in your blood, in your father's words, in the quiet spaces between everything you thought defined you. The greatest competition Michael Jordan ever entered was not in an arena. It had no clock, no crowd, no scoreboard. It was the competition between the man the world made him and the man he actually was. He won, not loudly, not with a celebration. He won the way the most important victories are won, quietly, in a clearing, in the red dirt, in the shade of a wide tree, next to an old man who had been waiting. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We would love to know where you are watching from. Leave a comment below sharing your location and what part of this journey moved you the most. Was it the moment in the clearing? The carved figure? The words of Michael's father? Tell us. For another inspiring story that will move you just as much, click the video appearing on your screen right now. You won't want to miss it.